Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So we are going to start with the closing session of the closing plenary session of the ERF Annual Meeting 2022. Ishaq Diwan, your host today, and I will be chairing this session that promises to be an optimistic, I hope, and closing session that will leave us all with dynamism for the coming year. So as discussed in the past 2 days, the current socioeconomic situation in our region is extremely difficult at the moment. Policymakers face at least 3 big challenges: macro imbalances, low growth and job creation, and at the same time, high level of popular aspirations. It's difficult. It's a difficult trilemma, these 3 challenges at the same time. Actually, action to ease any one of these 3 challenges makes it somewhat harder to meet the other 2 challenges. So in that sense, it is a trilemma. The danger in this situation is for policymakers to kind of lower their expectations in the face of these big challenges. The alternative that we want to push in this panel is at the opposite, to abandon the idea of business as usual and to find innovative solutions, to allow necessity to become the mother of invention, if you want, like the proverb says. So the goal of the session is indeed to examine initiatives from around the region that innovate in the face of adversity and that have started already to create some hope that progress is possible. And so we will try to conclude with a guarded note of optimism, a sort of yes, we can, if you like. I want to ask the organizer if we could see the panel's pictures on the screen. I don't see mine, for example. Okay, excellent. So I want to start by introducing our speakers. We have an incredible panel for this closing session, and really they are so accomplished in research, in politics, in the private sector, that given each one due justice would take the whole session. So I will have to be telegraphic while introducing them. We're going to start with Jihad Azour, who is the director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF. He is a PhD in international finance from the Institut d'études politiques of Paris, with a postdoctoral work at Harvard. He was the finance minister of Lebanon. He was also in the private sector, has created and led Inventis Partners, had senior positions also at McKinsey and at Booth. He published many books and articles. So Jihad, thank you for being with us. He'll be followed by Youssef Ibrahim. He's an economic advisor at the Amiri Diwan in Kuwait, with a distinguished career, a PhD in economics from Claremont Graduate University. He was Minister of Finance in Kuwait. He was Minister of Planning, and he was Minister of Education. He was the Dean of the School of Business at Kuwait University and on the board of many institutions of high learning, including the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences, KFAS, which we all know, and the Arab Open University. And he also held senior positions in the financial sector and was member and leader of various NGOs as well. He is also the author of many research papers, books, and reports. We also hope to have with us Mr. Fathallah Walalu. He hasn't joined us yet. He's an eminent economist and politician from Morocco, now with the Policy Center for the New South, a PhD in economics also from the University of Paris, professor at Mohammed V universities and other universities, president of the Association of Moroccan Economists and the Union of Arab Economists. He was the founder and leader of a political party, a noted parliamentarian, the mayor of Rabat, and the Minister of Finance of Morocco for over a decade. He's also the author of numerous books and articles. I very much hope he will join us. We also have Ibrahim Al-Badawi, the current managing director of the ERF. He has a PhD in economics from North Carolina and Northwestern universities. He was Minister of Finance of Sudan very recently in the recent post-revolution progressive cabinet. In academia, he's associated with the universities of Khartoum and Jazeera. He was director of the economic research at the Dubai Economic Council, a lead economist at the World Bank Research Department, and the research director of the African Economic Research Consortium in Nairobi, of course, at various moments in time. He's an extremely prolific writer with 13 books and over 90 published articles. And finally, we have Ariane Dehan with us, a development expert who specializes on development strategies, a very noted thinker with the International Development Research Center, the IDRC of Canada, in charge right now of the very important challenge of thinking of how to integrate climate and gender equity in the recovery from COVID-19 and in the transition to low carbon economies. He has worked in some of the most prestigious development agencies, the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, the DFID, UK Department of International Development in London, and then in India, and then in China, and also at the Poverty Research Center at the University of Sussex. He's widely published, and he's the editor of the Canadian Journal of Development Studies. It did take me 7 minutes, but it should have taken much more. We're really delighted to have such a strong panel. We're going to start with Jihad. We're being translated to Arabic and to French. So I'll ask people to look at the interpretation button on the bottom right, and they can choose their channel. We're being recorded, and this will be on the YouTube channel of ERF and on our website. After 5 interventions, we'll go to a Q&A, and I ask participants to already start putting their questions as we go in the Q&A sections, and I will bring the questions to the panel or call on some of you as well as we go. So let's try to limit ourselves to about 10 minutes in the first intervention. Jihad, I'm not choosing Your Excellency and the like, given that we're all friends at ERF. So Jihad, if you want to start and give us a feel for the various difficulties that the region is confronting now, and you look into the future. I know you just published today a very important blog on the challenges of climate adaptation, and what innovation you see bubbling in this region as you travel around.
Ishaq, thank you very much for having me with such high caliber panel, and you're putting the bar high on all of us to conclude this annual meetings, where I would say many changes are happening and uncertainties are extremely high, and you want us to see the future in bright eyes. Let me take one step back to start, and then the second step is where we stand today, and then if we look forward, what are the silver linings that one can think of? If I take a step back, 2 years ago, when the COVID crisis outbreak in the region was among the first in the world, many have raised certain number of big question marks about the ability of the region to cope with this kind of unraveling crisis. And I would say, despite the diversity that we have in the region in terms of resources, capacity, institutions, we saw that countries were able relatively to have a good way of managing the crisis by protecting lives and livelihoods in the beginning, introducing certain number of measures on the fiscal as well as also on the financial side. The fact that many of the countries have fixed exchange rate regime, therefore they were not able to resort to monetary instruments. But we saw that the region, compared to other parts of the world, was able to reduce the number of cases but more importantly, the number of fatalities. The second phase, and here also we saw a certain number of innovations, and I would say this has helped to build a certain level of trust that was missing before. The second phase was the phase of, I would say, adaptation to the COVID crisis. And here we saw a certain number of initiatives that one, I think, would like to explore further. One of the silver lining of the region that we saw a certain number of countries moving very quickly on investing in vaccination, not only limiting circulation of people, but becoming even more innovative, using technology for that. Of course, here we have certain number of countries that I would say differentiated themselves from the rest. Some of them are in the GCC, but also we saw other countries. Morocco, for example, was one of the countries that have accelerated the level of vaccination and was able also, parallel to the vaccination, to develop certain number of new instruments using technology to help those who were in informality. Informality proved to be, contrary to the past, an accelerator of the crisis, and not as a buffer as the crisis that we used to have in the past. And therefore, providing those kind of services and using technology for that allowed to have a fast deployment of support to citizens. We saw also the capacity of certain countries to modulate the level of support that they have provided, focus it and target it in order to make sure that with the limited resources, they are able to reach the maximum number of people. And here, when we compare to other parts of the world, the level of fiscal support in terms of percentage of GDP remained limited, around 1.5% to 2% of GDP. But we saw that countries were, I would say, smart in using the constraints of limited resources. And this has led us to the end of 2021, where the region started to recover faster. If you take the case of oil exporting countries, the recovery was led by the non-oil sector, which was an important show of resilience. In other parts of the region, we saw also the capacity to rein in inflation faster than maybe we saw in other parts of the world, and some regain access to the global value chain. Morocco is one, Egypt is another one, and also certain number of other countries. Certain number of innovations were deployed during this crisis, and most of them were driven by technology and, I would say, rapid response or an approach to responding to the crisis. And the first lesson is, in time of crisis, crisis management is something that the region has the flexibility to deploy. Yet the issue is for countries in conflict and low-income countries, where, for example, the level of vaccination remained very low, below 10% of the population. Where do we stand now? We were expecting, beginning of the year, that the region will recover at a rate of 4.5%. Inflation will grow, but I would say less than what we were expecting. We were expecting that 2023 will be a year where growth will accelerate fast in the GCC because of the recovery in oil production due to the easing of the OPEC Plus agreement. But also we were expecting in the oil importing countries that the recovery will accelerate. And our focus was, as a fund, to move from supporting countries dealing with the shock, which we deployed, as you know, $20 billion in terms of rapid facility, to something that will have them in the transition, I would say, to a faster and transformative recovery. And this is last year. We provided the SDR 650 billion worldwide. The region got around 50 billion. And the idea was to use this liquidity in order to allow countries to accelerate their transformation. Where are the promising, I would say, avenues of recovery? One, definitely the fact that the region is a young region. Okay, currently it's a curse because 30% of the youth of the region are unemployed. And one of the key problems that we saw during the COVID crisis, that women and youth were the most affected. But yet, when you look at some of the recent survey, the Arab Youth Survey is showing that the youngs of the region are in fact hoping in a fast recovery and believing in the future, not only in the GCC, which is something we expect, but also in other parts of the world. Therefore, what was and still important is how to accelerate the recovery in order to provide real inclusion of those who would make the difference, youth and women. And I would be very much waiting to see Arjan talking to us about how climate and gender, which I totally believe that those go hand in hand, could be made effective. Therefore, accelerating the recovery was to use what is currently our challenge into an opportunity. Use the fact that we have relatively well-educated young population, use technology to accelerate. And we saw in the last year or so, a lot of new startups coming in. And we saw, I would say, a strong confidence that the youth started to have in their ability to lead the recovery. Second, climate is definitely an issue that we need to address, because otherwise the region will be suffering, but gaps will widen. And it's not only about income gaps, but also about gaps of having access to resources. Inequalities will increase, gaps also will widen. And therefore, we need to focus on that, and we need to make it also not only as a targets, but also as a drivers. Definitely, we need to reduce carbon emissions, and we see many countries developing their strategies for the medium term to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2040. But there are countries who did not contribute to, I would say, climate issues, but they are now facing the issue of adapting to that, or they need to transition out of it. And therefore, those countries need support, and they need some financial support. And here, the combination between public support to increase the level of research, for example, where private money doesn't go, this is an avenue that the region needs to explore. But also, we need to provide the framework for the private sector to come in. And this is something that is one of the priorities, but also one of the silver linings. The second one is related to the women's participation and reforming, I would say, the labor market. We saw also a certain number of interesting developments. The GCC, which usually was conservative in terms of labor laws, moved on these issues. And we see a greater women participation. We see also a greater participation of the expat community, which increases productivity and allow better utilization of resources. This is an area where we need to invest in. Our research and others' research is showing that you can expand GDP in 10 years by almost $1 trillion by catching up with other EMs, emerging markets, in terms of women participation. Financial inclusion. The region is rich in money, but not good in terms of channeling these resources. We are very low in terms of financial inclusion, around 3 to 5% of GDP, while in other EMs, emerging economies, it's between 15 to 20%. If we improve on this, this will channel a huge amount of resources. And let me take also another example that we saw during the crisis, remittances. With the development of mobile money and technology, we saw huge level of predictability and support and reduction in the cost of transfers. Therefore, we have certain number of items that are on the positive side of our balance sheet. What is on the negative side of the balance sheet? This new crisis has hit the region hard because it affected the food, and the region is food dependent, and food is very important in the consumption basket of the low-income people. Countries have improved their social protection mechanism, as we saw, for example, in Egypt, with the takaful others. But I think here the issue.
Sorry, Jihad, keep going.
No, and I will, I'm about to conclude. I think here we need to think about how we provide a floor for the low-income people to protect their income, especially with the increase in inflation that has now been boosted by the increase in food prices, in order to protect those who are the most vulnerable, protect social stability, but at the same time also transform the subsidy system to something that is more modern and more effective. And we have an opportunity today. The second opportunity is how to have a better utilization of our resources. If we are oil exporter or oil importers, we are heavy user of resources, be it water, be it gasoline, be it electricity. I think we need also to see how we can improve the way we manage our resources. Last but not the least, I see the region now diverging in terms of growth. The oil exporting have a windfall because of the oil price. And I am happy to still see that most of them are very conscious that this windfall need to be used for the great transformation. But also, on the other hand, there are a certain number of countries where growth will be affected at a time where inflation is picking up. Therefore, we need to have a new partnership at the region, and we should not shy away from talking again about partnership, integration, cooperation. It has to be forward-looking. It should learn from the past mistakes, but I see this as new space, as new, I would say, frontier of bringing growth and development to the region. And I would conclude that also we as international institutions, we have a responsibility too, because we should make sure that support is maintained and expanded to countries of our region. And I know that many are asking this question now with the war in Ukraine, that maybe resources will be diverted elsewhere. I think it's very important to make sure that everybody who is in need to be supported in this transformation will be. Let me stop with that. Over to you, Ashaq. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jihad. I think this narrative is extremely effective. Coming out of COVID, having learned the sense of urgency for rapid response, the use of technology, rebuilding trust in policy, in the ability of our societies to cooperate and advance to address the list of challenges that remain that you've listed, plus climate, plus social transformation and the gender issues, and I think protect the poor. And we will hear about innovations on social safety nets in this discussion. And finally, the remaining importance, and even more than before, of regional cooperation and integration. I think this provides a wonderful start for our panel. I want to welcome Mr. Fathallah Walal, who has managed to join us. Hello, bonjour, bonsoir. It's great to have you. We're going to move next to Dr. Ibrahim Youssef. Your turn. Tell us, how did Kuwait manage with this big challenge? More needs, less resources, and I don't see your deficit haven't increased a whole lot. How did you do it?
Thank you, Ishaq. Good evening, everyone. As you know, Jihad put it in a very nice way, an overview about the region and especially the GCC. So maybe I'd like to zoom in on Kuwait. Kuwait's initial response to the pandemic was to protect the health of its people and to prevent the collapse of its health system. These measures were described by the WHO as decisive, rapid, and comprehensive. However, these measures of isolating the country from the rest of the world and taking severe measure of partial and complete lockdown, which represent about 20% days of the year 2020, led to negative consequences on the economy. The GDP grew by -8%, and particularly all the SMEs and the labor market, especially on foreign labor working in the private sector. Kuwait was unable to use the ordinary direct stimulus measures as the rest of the world to revive the economic activities due to continuing decline in oil prices, which went below $20 per barrel, and the limitation of other liquidity resources due to the depletion of the General Reserve Fund and the expiration of the public debt law, which allows the government to borrow from the financial institutions. Furthermore, the democratic political system in the country has contributed to delays in the economic decision-making process, such as the renewal of the public debt law and other economic reform measures. To deal with the situation, the government took innovative measures that had the least financial burden coupled with public satisfaction. Among these measures are, I will go quickly over these measures. From the start of the pandemic, to gain the public trust, the government arranged to bring back all its citizens trapped outside Kuwait. More than 30,000 Kuwaitis were outside Kuwait at that time, and provided them with housing and meals for 2 weeks before being reunited with their families at no cost to them. The second, the government continued paying salaries of the public sector employees, which represent the majority of the Kuwaiti labor force. And the third, the government cut and eliminated government fees and charges temporarily during the crisis. And the fourth is the postponement of the repayment of all personal loans in the financial institution for 6 months with no extra cost. The fifth is the freezing of all SMEs, industrial and agriculture repayment of loans for 6 months, and it was renewed for another 6 months. Also, the central bank cut the discount rate twice in 1 month, in total of 125 basis points to 1.5%, and lowered the capital adequacy ratio, risk weighting, among other measures to protect the financial sector, but to allow it to support the economy. Seventh, the government and the banks provided the businesses 3-year loans at 2.5% interest rate. The government would pay the interest for year 1 and half of year 2. Also, the government provided 3-year loans to SMEs at an interest rate of 2.5% to cover wages, rental, and others. And it would pay the full interest for year 1 and 2 and half of the year 3. The SMEs fund would provide 80% of these loans at 0 interest. These was in the short term. In the medium and long term, the government is pursuing major economic reform to achieve the goals of 2035 vision. Some highlights of these measures are the following: presenting 2 draft tax laws to the parliament, the first one in the VAT and the second on the excise taxes. Second, conducting a major study by the Higher Council for Planning and Development on a new structure for the government that redefines its role, improves government decision-making, and reforms the country's social safety system. These reforms will help to fulfill Kuwait's Vision 2035 and build the basis for sustainable growth and job creation for future generations. They are urgently required to overcome the current serious fiscal and economic crisis. And now the ball is in the hand of the government to implement this detailed study. Another measure is a draft law for the Northern Economic Zone project was submitted to the parliament. This project is to build free economic zone that covers an area of more than 9% of the total Kuwait area. It includes containers, port, railway, and green zone. It will house more than 42 major projects covering healthcare, education, technology, oil sectors, and SMEs incubators, among others. The whole project is valued between 450 to 600 billion US dollars, and it's estimated to contribute between 15 to 20 billion to the GDP, which adding more than 15% to the current GDP level, and to create more than 200,000 jobs with more than 400,000 inhabitants in that area. Unfortunately, the Sheikh Nasser Sabah Al-Ahmed, who passed away, was the champion of this project. And now there is some delay with the parliament to pass this law. China is negotiating with the government to participate in this project as part of the China Belt and Road Initiative, as you know. This is a quick overview of innovative ideas that Kuwait tried to implement during and after crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. We will bring these innovations, especially what you've said about the job creation part into the discussion. I know that Mr. Walalu is having difficulty connecting, so we're gonna move now, Brahim, to you, and give us a sense. You had, I know, amazing challenges. Basically, a situation where government spending was, close to zero, 5% of GDP or so. Much of the spending was in subsidies, and you had to agree with Jihad on an IMF program. They were very demanding, and the street was not very happy. How did you manage to square the circle? I know you had one big innovation you want to tell us about. You are muted.
Thank you very much, Ishaq, for framing this fascinating conversation, and Jihad for giving us a very interesting perspective, responsive perspective, so to speak, from the IMF to the emerging challenges that we face in the region. And of course, Yusuf for giving us perspective from an economy that is, that's a different world compared to what we are facing in Sudan. But of course, we know that Sudan provide a huge promise for not only the international partners, but even countries in the region in terms of investment opportunities once we put our house in order. Actually, I will speak about my own personal experience as somebody who's essentially a researcher and academic, but concerned social scientist about issues in Sudan, my home country. And I decided to take the responsibility of accepting the position of finance minister after what we call in Sudan the glorious December revolution. And for us, it is indeed a glorious revolution. Unfortunately, the challenges were quite daunting. Just to give you a quick example, the budget itself is, of course, since actually the partitioning of the country in 2011 and the creation of the Republic of South Sudan, it constituted, the economy of Sudan constituted or seemed to have received a huge sudden stop. We all know about the literature on sudden stop, but this is actually a sudden stop of multifaceted dimensions that impacted the budget significantly, while the former government was a kleptocratic government par excellence. Institutional corruption, extreme corruption, isolation, and country slapped with an ensemble of very difficult sanctions and what have you. So when the new government, the transitional government, came to power, we faced this situation. I can give you numbers such as that, for example, the deficit account for 38% of revenues, and the revenue itself, the resource mobilization, was like about ranging between 6 to 8% of GDP. Actually, about half of the African standard, which itself was considered low compared to other developing regions. The allocation of the major resources itself was extremely distorted. For example, the budget allocated to commodity subsidies, such as the petroleum subsidies, account for 40% of the budget. While the combined allocation to education, health, and social safety net accounts for only 16%. So you have, more than 3 times the combined budget of education, health, and social safety nets. And so it's a very daunting thing, while at the same time you have a revolution that raised expectations of Sudanese people, especially the Sudanese youth, who were the bread and butter, actually, of that revolution. They paid considerable price in order to topple the former regime. And they have expectations. So it has been very difficult to actually convince them that, making good on this expectation requires some painful adjustment. And we tried to be as innovative as possible. So we came up with this communication strategy. And in fact, I even had an opportunity to discuss this with the managing director of the IMF, who told me that you are doing the right thing because the communication strategy is as important as the strategy itself. And we came up with this idea that we are not going to lift subsidies, we are going to transit from subsidizing commodities to directly empowering Sudanese people. And the instruments that, or the programs for achieving this were twofold. And I actually remember I had an opportunity, if you remember, Ishaq, at my apartment in Khartoum, when you told me that actually the share of wages and salaries in Sudan is less than 3% or 4%. And this would be an opportunity actually to raise or to review the salary scale. And we did exactly that. We established, a commission that studied this, and they came up with a recommendation. So we actually increased the, we introduced a new salary scale as one instrument of empowering Sudanese people and attempting to shore up the middle class. And then the other one was the direct cash transfers, what we call the family support. And the international community responded very vigorously and generously. The World Bank provided 400 million, and the bilateral donors provided another 500 million. So we had close to a 1 billion in that. I thought that this has been a very creative and courageous way to actually, motivate and introduce the. But unfortunately, we also, we got rid of the Muslim Brothers as a result of the revolution. But then we have to deal with a left kind of movement that was frozen in time. Still preaching the slogans of the 1950s and 60s. And so we had a very, difficult struggle. But on a positive note, actually, on a really positive note, and this is not just kind of my own personal popularity or anything of that sort, but the popularity of the reform. Everywhere I go now, and in the social media, there is a very strong support now to the reform that was enacted before the coup that took place in the 25th of October. And now, hopefully, if Sudan return back to the constitutional process, which hopefully might happen, I think the society, the Sudanese community now, and the civil society now, they seem to start to appreciate the necessity of reform and the value that comes with it, including the debt relief and the rehabilitation of Sudan as a member in good standing in the international financial and development community. So that's the positive note I would like to end with.
Thank you, Rahim. This is really a fascinating story. You've lived it. And I think we've learned from around the world that people that don't trust the state want to see the money through subsidies. And it's when they start trusting the state that they would trust that the money would be better used through the state. And you had started to do that. And let's hope, as you said, that the constitutional process is back on track so that this process, this progress can continue. We are going to move now to Ariane. So Ariane, there's clearly a need for more flows, financial flows. Perhaps try to pay less debt. The external and the domestic debts are increasingly costly, taking a big share of the budget. We haven't talked about that yet very much. Are there innovative ways of reducing these costs, of increasing the flows, maybe of tapping into new kinds of flows on climate, and reducing crowding out, and hopefully moving some of the domestic funding to improve the access to finance by SMEs. What have you learned recently from your work around the world? I know you work in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, that could be applicable to the region.
Thanks very much, Cesar, and thanks for the panel. I very much hope we continue this conversation. What Ibrahim was just telling us was so fascinating. I must say, in terms of innovative ways of financing, I am a Dutch Calvinist, so we are very skeptical of the idea that you can create new money. But I do think, and I very much appreciate the call for, it's not about optimism for me. Again, I am a Calvinist, but it's very much, this is the situation where we're in. I listened closely. I think I'm going to listen to that again, what Carmen Reinhardt said on the first day on this fantastic conference. And these are the challenges we have. But one thing I do want to add, it's actually not part of the presentation as I prepared it, but and again, building on what Ibrahim was just saying, and some of my experience is based on working in the UK, as you said, is out in the late 1990s, and to generate the debt relief that existed, that was mobilized then, and I think that was significant, including promoted by the UK government. For the UK public, it was really important to show that debt relief would have developmental outcomes. There is aid fatigue in donor countries, and these are only, to some extent relevant. And it was really, and I know that the Jubilee campaign at that point of time was really, they really both promoted and fed that back to the taxpayers in the global north to show that had a developmental objective. So I think that story in itself is relevant. The 5 points that I wanted to add here, and hopefully these are useful, thinking about the growing debt crisis and debt relief, and the key question, put a slightly different perhaps, but the same I think as you said, how can development objectives be integrated into that debt relief, that public debt management, and of course this is closely related to any fiscal policy. And I have to add that indeed is based on global experience. It's not based on I'm not an economist, but I read closely the work on how can we integrate development objectives into macroeconomic policy, and draw on the work of many great scholars on that. And I want to focus on the debt crisis. We want to be optimistic, but I think the importance of the growing debt crisis cannot be overstated. I think Carmen was very clear about that. It had been rising, of course, different in different countries, of course, very different in Kuwait, however, they're a different story. But public debt in low-income countries had been rising before the pandemic. With the pandemic, the growing inflation now poses more problems, and of course with the war, and in many low-income countries, I think it's important that it's a combination of factors, but that is adding to the stimulus measures that were being put in place, are already being withdrawn, and the packages of support to the IMF are really important there. So a few thoughts, as I said, about lessons from past debt crisis. I think others know this much better than I do, but it's not worth highlighting something that Stephanie Griffith-Jones says every time she presents this. The urgency cannot be overstated. International negotiations take a long time. Debt overhang have long-term implication, and all that is to say, we know that from the adjustment in the 1980s, 1990s. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that the need for action is absolutely now. The second thing to say that again, building on the experience of the late 1990s, that the discussion I think now is much more difficult. The composition of debt has changed dramatically. Chinese lending, of course, is important in many cases. I am not making any statements about that is worse or better, but it is there. And private sector creditors equally have become much more important. There too, I'm not making an argument that it's good or bad, but that it makes debt management different and much more complicated than it was led by the Paris Club. And I think that's what Carmen was highlighting. It puts discussion about the role of IMF and World Bank in very different perspectives. It will be different in each case. I don't know if that was the case for Sudan. And with that, I think it's important to reiterate what I think Carmen said, but I need to hear much more about it. That the current debt relief initiatives are stalling. I would love to hear more of whether that's actually the case. And I don't know what the reasons are, but she did mention that the difficulty of bringing the private sector initiatives to the table plays a key role. So it may be good to dive deeper into proposals to replicate, for example, the Brady Plan. Again, Stephanie Griffith-Jones and others have been highlighting. In any case, discussions about and research on debt on debt management and how this links to national economic policy has to be incorporated in the new reality. I think it's with jihad in the table. If I had prepared better, I probably would have skipped this point, but I think the point about the discussion about conditionalities is really important. And again, Ibrahim's discussion about what happened in Sudan is really relevant. There's much agreement on the importance of international financial institution conditionalities for national policy making, the different views on this, and how this can, in the past, has contributed to social discontent. And I think the innovation that Ibrahim just narrated, I think, is absolutely critical. I think it's important to think about that conditionalities, and lots of research shows that they are not really working because they often don't really embed in policy making. And the argument I would make there is that it's really important that the local research plays a role in that, in assessing conditionalities for appropriateness, for context, and thinking about implementation. And that's not to say that the IMF and the World Bank don't do that, but I think local research communities have a great role to play in it. Two points then, specific ones on how can, from the experience, the little experience that I have, how can development objectives be integrated into the management of debt and with that fiscal policies. And I think actually the IMF has done an enormous amount of work on this, and the argument I'm just making is like these are priorities at the moment. The one thing that I would say let me skip that and go to the two specific opportunities. I think the first opportunity is to think about whether debt management and adjustment can incorporate considerations of equity, and I focus on gender. And I would highlight there that IMF now considers gender as macro critical. Adjustment and economic policies can have severe impact on vulnerable groups, including women. With the pandemic, the impact on women are very clear, so it's an even more important question than it already was. Therefore, I'd say research can play a role in assessing the potential impacts of different measures on different groups across economic policies, be it interest rate taxations. There are no instruments to apply that, and I think we can benefit, we can support this through bringing those lessons from how this has worked in different contexts. And so there's been much innovation in terms of understanding growth as well as distributional impacts, and this can play a key role in highlighting potential win-wins and minimize trade-offs in adjustment and reforms. I will post a link to one of the papers on that by Professor J.T. Coase, and I would, as an example, would merely highlight the discussion about the care economy. We can now demonstrate that investment in childcare is not only a gender equity and justice issue, but can also have potential economic benefits. I'm not saying that's there in all contexts, but certainly analysis that shows that how those considerations can be integrated, and the kind of research, analysis, and evidence that contribute. Now similarly, The second area of incorporating development objectives in debt management is around climate and climate finance, of course, and the impact of climate change in the region, as was in the IMF blog by Jihad and others this morning, is absolutely critical. And now on top of the pandemic, debt and war, the climate crisis having multiple impacts, and climate, of course, also in the IMF is now considered macro critical. As part of debt management, one of the instruments that are very much worth considering and has been done in many contexts is debt for climate or debt for nature swaps. There's growing experience on this. And again, it needs the local evidence and initiative to explore the potentials and make it work. For that too, I will post a link to a recent paper we supported with UNECA and IIED in London, and it recommends, of course, different instruments for different contexts. For less debt-distressed countries with reasonable market access, general purpose performance bonds for climate and nature are recommended, and for the most indebted countries, the recommendation is with less market access is to focus on direct debt for climate and nature swaps. Countries in debt distress could reduce debt either by converting local currency, repayment of lower interest rate, or some form of debt write-off in the best cases in agreement with the creditors, or by changing the instrument used through refinancing. And the money saved would then be used for government systems to achieve the agreed key performance indicators on climate resilience, on protecting biodiversity. I know that was very quick. Like I said, I will post the link to these papers. These are mere examples of potentials where, like I said, we can integrate it. It is possible to integrate the development objectives, climate objectives, into macroeconomics, specifically into that. There is not one way of doing that. It needs a local experimentation and a local evidence, and this is what I hope we can contribute to. As you said, Ishaq, we can't stand with the pessimism, the problems of the crisis, but need to look forward to a more inclusive and greener recovery. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Ariane. You have really broadened the discussion in a super useful way, and this gives us really good fuel for a second round. It's good. We still have a good half hour, so I'd like us to follow up on three types of issues. I mean, first, in terms of a broad summary, I'd say, we're coming out of COVID and we are hit by the Ukrainian war, but there's crisis, and as Jihad put it, on the other side of the balance sheet, there is more momentum, there is more trust that challenges can be addressed, resources can be used better. Technology can be used, the sense of urgency to mobilize people and cabinet and societies can be mobilized. Now, we've also discovered SMEs, the power of women entering the labor force, having more voice. They are fiscal, this tight budget, how to use the finances more effectively, how to raise more taxes in a fairer way. They are in the private sector that really needs to come to the rescue much more with technology, with disruption of markets, with competition. This is a message that all of us keep pushing. Social change is happening, need to be supported, especially on gender, on education, on mechanism where society gets more involved in making sure that whole system, that resource can be used more effectively. And the new challenges on climate, which are also an opportunity, because while our region is the most affected by climate change, it's also the one that is most advantaged at producing solar energy for export to the world. So I want us to come back on three areas, and we can take them maybe one by one and go around quickly with your views. One is, what is an adjustment with a human face in today's world? Could we think of, we obviously will need IMF programs, that workouts in many countries. In Egypt now, there are discussions. In Sudan, the program has to be rearranged. In Tunisia, a program is needed soon. Perhaps in Morocco, in Jordan, Lebanon is negotiating. We're going to see many programs. And so there's a lot of thinking about what these programs can look like. To what extent could they be low on austerity and high on self-accepted conditionality for growing out of debt? An old idea, but whose time maybe has come. To what extent is this feasible, given that it hasn't worked in the past? Would the new momentum make that work? And can the SDRs that are floating around help in this? After all, the GCC has something like 20 billion in unused SDRs. Can they be reallocated to this kind of program? So I want to start with that, and then I want to move to how the changing globalization is affecting the growth prospects in the region, and finally, a few thoughts of so can we start with the first, or if you want to mix with others? We go in the same order. Jihad, you want to start us?
You're raising important issues and a complex one. Okay, let me take a bit broaden a bit the issue or your question, and not to look at the programs per se. Look at type of support that the fund and other international institutions could provide countries with. And here I want to add 3 points to the discussion. One is the type of financial support is correlated or is related to the type of issues that we want to address. I'll give you an example. COVID crisis came, we provided rapid finance facility that was unconditional. The only request that we have asked country with is spend the money transparently and also make sure that the money is going in the right direction, which is to help protect lives. This money was, or those lendings came up very quickly. The region benefited by around $2 billion, and it was very fast in terms of dispersing. No conditionality, targeted to the issue that we were addressing. Therefore, the financial facilities that the fund provides are facilities that are purposed to the type of issue that you are confronted with.
Voilà,
on,
c'est ce que j'allais
dire. On the other extreme, the new facility that the fund has put in place, the RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, it is something that is revolutionary for the fund because it's a long-term financing that the fund has never used so far with highly concessional rates. Therefore, instruments need to be put in the context of the type of support countries need. The second issue that you have raised is how to make the reform packages that come with this financing, because this financing comes in order to reduce the burden of the adjustment, because otherwise you need to do more, okay? How to have the right, I would say, architecture of that. And here things have evolved over time. The current thinking is you need to provide the social floor, but not only quantitative social floor in terms of amount of spending, but to go more specifically and link and condition, for example, the disbursement in tranches with certain number of social actions. I give you an example. In Jordan, we introduced specific targets on providing social services to women because it proved to be one of the major impediments for women's participation in economy. Public transportation, especially we saw it during COVID, that one of the issues that we had to face is women participation in the economy is a more complex issue than only providing training or financial support. Therefore, this concept has been now became more integrated in the way we deal with issues. 3 is we have deepened our analytical work into 2 important areas. One is the political economy of reforms, and I will not go into that. The second one is on how to address issues that will improve inclusion. And inclusion is not only about how you distribute your spending. Inclusion is also about to have better tax system that provides the incentive on one hand, increase the social justice on the other hand, and is efficient in terms of and transparent in terms of fiscal management. Therefore, we are getting more into the complexities of the issues that we used to do in the past. My last point is we experienced over the last 2 years, and this is something that to follow up on what Arjan was saying, we experienced 2 important developments. One, we did 2 important debt relief transactions during the COVID crisis. One was for Somalia and the other one was Sudan. Sudan is $65 billion. This is the largest debt relief operation that the fund has done since the HIPC initiative. And this was something that, thanks to Ibrahim and his colleagues, happened, but unfortunately, we all know what happened after. But those 2 debt relief initiatives took place during COVID crisis. The other thing that took place also during COVID crisis is the DSSI, the debt service relief, plus the common framework for debt restructuring. Here, I would say the intention is still very much there, but we did not see a lot of countries coming. Until now, we have only 3 countries benefiting from that, and it's very complicated. And the complication is coming because of also the multiplicity of debtors outside the Paris Club. Therefore, we need to look also at the framework of addressing these issues, how to bring the private sector. And here it's very interesting, Arjan, during the COVID crisis, the private sector did not want to have that restructuring. They accepted to increase funding to countries and not go to the debt restructuring. Maybe it came at a time where interest rates were extremely low and liquidity was extremely high. Therefore, the question going forward, what is going to be market behavior at the time where interest rates are going up, and with the exit from the tapering, that liquidity may not be as available as it was. Therefore, we are at an important moment. It's a crossroad moment that we saw in the past. We need to learn from past experience. We need to put it into a forward-looking approach, and also we need to take into consideration that any reprofiling of that has to take into consideration the social dimension of it. It cannot be done only on a financial terms. Back to you, Ishaq.
You had a lot of important, and I think the principles you put on the table are super. We would need another conversation starting there. I want to welcome Mr. Fathallah Walal, who managed to join us. Thank you for your perseverance. Fathallah, what language would you like to speak? I think you may be muted. Okay. Somebody's going to help you. We're very happy you're with us.
Okay.
Voilà, on vous entend.
إن سمحتم سأتكلم بالعربية.
تفضل.
أولا أريد أن أقول أنني سعيد بالمشاركة في هذه الندوة من خلال تقديم التجربة المغربية فيما يتعلق بالسياسة الماكرو الاقتصادية خاصة بعد الجائحة. بالأساس المعروف أن هذه السياسات الماكرو اقتصادية التي برزت بالأساس منذ الثمانينات في القرن الماضي تهتم بتجاوز الاختلالات المالية الخارجية والداخلية، والتحكم كذلك في التضخم، ومصاحبة السياسات إصلاح في المجال الاجتماعي والمجال الاقتصادي. ولنستوعب التجربة المغربية في الفترة الأخيرة في سنوات 1920 إلى هذه السنة 2022 لابد أن نرجع إلى طبيعة السياسة الماكرو اقتصادية خاصة في مرحلتين. المرحلة الأولى كانت في الثمانينات القرن الماضي، بحيث عرف الاقتصاد المغربي عدة مشاكل على غرار العديد من البلدان: تفاقم العجز الداخلي للموازنة، وتفاقم كذلك للعجز الخارجي، ومديونية مرتفعة، وبارتباط بالأساس مع صندوق النقد الدولي بالأساس، وإلى حد ما البنك العالمي بالنسبة للإصلاحات البنيوية. انخرط المغرب كالعديد من بلدان الجنوب في سياسة التقويم أو الإصلاح الهيكلي التي كانت متبعة. الفترة الثانية بالأساس هي العشرية الأولى من هذا القرن، حيث تمكن المغرب من التحكم في اختلالاته، فقام ومن 2000 تقريبا إلى 2010 أو إلى حدود الأزمة الاقتصادية والمالية ل 2008. خلال هذه الفترة تمكن المغرب من تحسين توازناته الاقتصادية، وقام بإصلاحات بنيوية بكثير من الاستقلالية عن المؤسسات الدولية المالية. فالقطاع العمومي تقدم في إصلاحاته، حدثت عمليات خوصصة، المديونية نقصت إلى حد كبير، المنظومة البنكية تمكن المغرب من تمنيعها، وتمكن كذلك من إصلاح النظام الضريبي. في نفس الوقت كانت بعض الإصلاحات النوعية متعلقة بمحاربة الفقر، بالتنمية الاجتماعية، بالتقدم في مسألة المساواة بين الرجل والمرأة من خلال إخراج قانون مدونة الأسرة، بالاعتراف كذلك باللغة الأمازيغية بجانب اللغة العربية كلغتين رسميتين، بالمصالحة مع الماضي عبر تعويض ضحايا القمع السياسي إلى آخره، أو الاهتمام كذلك بالسكن الاجتماعي بالأساس. فهذه الفترة أعطت لبلادنا نوع من التجربة. الآن نأتي إلى مرحلة ما بعد الجائحة. في العالم كله ابتداء من البلدان المتطورة، السياسة الماكرو اقتصادية عرفت منعرجا بالنسبة للسياسات التي كانت تقليدية وأرثوذكسية إلى حد ما. منعرج لأنها فرضت على الدولة أن تغير أدوات تدخلها. أصبحت الدولة دولة اجتماعية، دولة حمائية بالنسبة للفقراء بالأساس، وبالنسبة للذين تضرروا، وخاصة كذلك المقاولات سواء الصغيرة أو الكبيرة، أو بعض القطاعات الأساسية، مثلا قطاع السياحة، مثلا الذي قطاع النقل خاصة الجوي، بسبب القرارات الحمائية التي تدخلت الدولة فيها وبجانب هذه الحماية، دور الحمائي للدولة، هناك دور استراتيجي آخر، وهناك كذلك منعرج أساسي في ما يتعلق بتغيير نسبيا إلى دور الدولة. هل يمكن أن نقول أننا رجعنا إلى التوجه الكينيزي الذي كان بعد الحرب العالمية الثانية إلى حد ما، ولكن في إطار دولي يختلف تماما على الإطار السائد بعد الحرب العالمية الثانية وإلى غاية الستينات؟ المغرب في كل هذا تأثر طبعا سلبا بالجائحة، حيث انكمش الإنتاج الداخلي الإجمالي في سنة 2020 بناقص 6.3، وتضررت بعض القطاعات الإنتاجية والخدماتية بفعل قرارات الحجر الصحي وإقفال الحدود، وعلى رأسها كما قلت السياحة التي انكمشت مداخلها ب80%، والنقل والخدمات والتجارة والعديد من القطاعات، مثلا قطاع البناء كذلك، باستثناء قطاع واحد الذي بقي يعني يتطور بشكل عادي، وهو قطاع إنتاجي وإصدار الفوسفات. الاستهلاك الداخلي كذلك تراجع ب8.6. وفي هذا الإطار أولا الدولة قامت ببعض الإجراءات لمواجهة الوضع الشاذ، إقفال الحدود مثلا البحرية والجوية والبرية في مارس 2020، إقفال المدارس والمعاهد والجامعات والمقاهي والمساجد، وإعلان حالة الطوارئ الصحية. في 19 مارس 2020 استمع المغاربة إلى خطاب الملكي الذي قررت من خلاله الدولة قرارات استثنائية، إقرار قرارات استثنائية، وخاصة إحداث صندوق خاص لمواجهة الآثار الاقتصادية للجائحة. تكلفت الدولة بكل الآثار الناتجة عن الجائحة، تكلفت بتوزيع الكمامات وبحملة التلقيح الأولى والثانية والثالثة، والتي يمكن أن أقول بأنها كانت ناجحة إفريقيا وعربيا. وتأسست لجنة في وزارة المالية برئاسة وزارة المالية ومشاركة الوزارات المعنية، الصحة والداخلية، ولكن كذلك بنك المغرب وممثلي المقاولات وممثلي البنوك. الهدف هو دراسة تحمل الدولة للنفقات ذات الطابع الصحي، ومساندة الساكنة التي تأثرت سلبا بالجائحة، ومساندة المقاولات كذلك. القرارات التي اتخذت هي متعددة، ولكن أبرز منها أنه سمح للمقاولات بأن تأخير أداء الضرائب، كذلك سمح للمقاولات بتأخير إرجاع ديونها البنكية، وأحدث منتوج بنكي سمي من طرف الدولة منتوج ضمان الأكسجين لصالح المقاولات الصغيرة والمتأثرة بالأزمة، وتمكينها بقروض في فترة معينة مدة 4 أشهر بدون فائدة. كذلك قامت الدولة بتوقيع اتفاقية مع ممثلي المقاولات ومع ممثلي البنوك للدفع بالعمل التنموي. هذا هو الدور ديال الدولة الذي ذكرته، دور استراتيجي لإعادة الحياة للحياة الاقتصادية. وفي هذا الإطار أسست الدولة صندوق سمي باسم الملك، صندوق محمد السادس، موجه بالأساس لتحفيز الاستثمار ومساندة الأنشطة الإنتاجية. وفي هذا الإطار أقرت برامج استعجالية لصالح القطاعات أكثر تأثراً، المطاعم مثلاً، السياحة، قطاعات الرياضة، الثقافية إلى آخره. وفي نفس الوقت اجتماعياً الدولة قررت توزيع توظيف شهري لمدة قدره 200 ما يقابل $200 لصالح الشغالين في القطاعات الغير منظمة، وإقرار مساعدة تضامن لصالح القطاع غير المنظم. في البنك المركزي كذلك تدخل ووظف أدواره وأدوار أدوات التدخل عن طريق التخلي عمليا عن المقاربات التقليدية الأرثوذكسية. قام بتخفيض معدل الفائدة المديري إلى 1.5 وساعد على دعم سيولة البنوك، فقام بتحرير المخزونات البنكية الإجبارية والزيادة في عدد المقاولات المستفيدة من عمليات إعادة التمويل، سواء تعلق الأمر بكل المقاولات الصغيرة والمتوسطة، المقاولات الصغيرة جدا، والمقاولات كذلك الكبرى التي تضررت بفعل الجائحة. وقامت بتليين القواعد الاحترازية بطبيعة. الآن أعتقد بصفة عامة الاقتصاد المغربي تمكن من تجاوز منغلق الجائحة. ففي سنة 2021 ارتفع معدل النمو ب7.3%. طبعا هناك عنصر لعب دوره كذلك، وهو أنه كانت سنة عرفت ظروف مطرية جيدة من ناحية الفلاحة، وهذا ليس هو الأمر مع الأسف هذه السنة. الذي أريد أن أختم به هو أنه الدولة في الظروف الحرجة، وهذا ظهر، يمكن أن تغير المسارات التقليدية والأرثوذكسية عندما تفرض الظروف التحول. وحتى صندوق النقد الدولي لما قام بتوزيع استثنائي لحقوق السحب الخاصة لكل الدول، هو نفسه يعني ابتعد على توجهاته التقليدية. الآن جاءت بعد الجائحة مخلفات الحرب القائمة بالنسبة لبلد كالمغرب الذي لم يعرف أبداً منذ 20 سنة أي مؤشر للتضخم. طبعاً مالياً ميزانية الدولة المدعمة خاصة للغذاء الشعبي بالأساس، والمدعمة كذلك للغاز المستورد، لأن ما عندناش نفط، ما عندناش غاز، والاقتصاد الوطني كله تأثر سلباً بارتفاع العديد من المشتريات وخاصة النفط. مع الأسف هذه السنة إلى غاية هذا الشهر مارس الأمطار لم تنزل على غرار ما حدث في السنة الفارطة. فهذا أوكرانيا إذن تفرض من جديد تعبئة السياسة المكرو الاقتصادية، والمطروح الآن عندنا وعند كل البلدان العربية الغير المنتجة للنفط بالأساس هو كيف نجد الأجوبة الضرورية لعدم الزيادة في الاختلالات في التوازنات ومتابعة الإصلاحات الاجتماعية والاقتصادية، وثالثا مواجهة مد ارتفاع الأسعار الناتج بالأساس على كل مخلفات أوكرانيا. وهذا أعتقد المفيد من التجربتين الكوفيد وأوكرانيا هو أنه هذه التجربتين تطرح على الدول كلها ضرورة نوع من التليين، نوع من الفلكسبيليتي بالنسبة للسياسة الاقتصادية والماكرو الاقتصادي. وأنا أعتقد هذا شيء مهم على المؤسسات الدولية التي تتابعنا. احنا المغرب استقلينا عن المؤسسات الدولية، ولكن هي تتابع مسار السياسة الاقتصادية، تتابع مسار التوازنات. عليها أن تستوعب، خاصة بالنسبة لبلدان الجنوب، وخاصة بالنسبة للبلدان الغير المنتجة للنفط والغاز، بأنه من الضروري عالميا ودوليا إيجاد أجوبة لما هو مطروح. إذا أخذنا البلدان المتطورة بعد الكوفيد، سمحت بنوكها مركزية، سمحت لها بأن تمول بشكل إضافي وأن تخلق العملة إلى حد ما في الولايات المتحدة، في الاتحاد الأوروبي. الاتحاد الأوروبي تمكنت بلدان الاتحاد الأوروبي بأن تخلق آلية مشتركة من أجل الاستدانة ومن أجل تمويل الانطلاقة الاقتصادية. احنا مديونيتنا ارتفعت خلال هذه السنة، في حين أن المغرب كان في طريق سليم لمواجهة المديونية ارتفعت. فالمطلوب الآن هو نوع من التفكير في إطار مجموعة ال20، في إطار صندوق النقد الدولي، في إطار مجموعة 7، بأن تعطى لهذه البلدان أسلحة للاستجابة للمديونية حتى لا ترتفع كما كان ذلك في الثمانينات القرن الماضي أو إلى حد ما في التسعينات. وهذا تفرض تفكيرا عالميا حول طبيعة السياسة الماكرو الاقتصادية في بلداننا. وأعتقد بأنه لما جاءت أوكرانيا أو أزمة أوكرانيا أو أزمة الحرب بعد الكوفيد، هذا يفرض بأنه يجب الدفع للتفكير في أدوات العمل. شكرا.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ ولال على الاقتراحات حقيقة للخروج، مثل ما بتقول، الخروج من الأرثوذكسية واكتشاف يعني أدوات عمل جديدة ملائمة أكثر للوضع الحالي. وحقيقة هذا الحديث اللي كنا عم نداول فيه، فخلينا نكمل. يمكن سمعنا من أستاذ أزعور، يمكن ننتقل لإبراهيم وبتعطينا اقتراحاتك على الأفكار اللي عم نفكر فيها، عم ندولها على التفكير العالمي، يعني للاستجابة للمديونية اللي عم ترتفع، وخاصة الفائدة الأمريكية المحتمل أنه ترتفع كمان أكثر حتى العالمية يعني في الأشهر الجايين. فشو تفكيرك يعني على التغييرات العالمية اللي معقولة تساعد البلاد مثل المغرب ومثل السودان وغير بلاد، يعني تونس والأردن ومصر، اللي هي يعني للاستجابة للوضع الحالي؟ إبراهيم. We can stay in English. You are muted.
Okay, let me say this. I think the issue of the debt is a huge issue. Obviously, you know, it requires adjustment on both sides, the creditors and the debtors. The debtor countries, such as our countries or most of our countries, they need actually to build trust and retool the techniques of resource mobilization, taking advantage of the digital platforms and the digital revolution, which, according to one World Bank study, could have a significant impact on the capacity of low-income and middle-income country to mobilize resources. But that's not enough. What is needed is to build trust. The value survey and the barometer, the African and the Arab barometer, suggest that the public in many countries in question, in African countries and also Arab countries or Middle Eastern countries, they actually don't trust the government with public resources. They basically are not confident that, I'm not saying all the governments, but at least some governments, in terms of using the collected revenues, to build, public goods or to deliver public goods. And so the answer to the question or to the survey that they would rather have less public goods than actually pay money that's not well used. So this is a huge trust deficit that needs to be addressed. This is on the side of the recipient. And also I would say that to the extent that the war on Ukraine somehow lead until adjustment happen by the Western importers of Russian oil and gas, which might take as long as 10 years. The prices of oil and gas are likely to remain high until eventually also renewable energy sources are developed, which could then constitute another potential shock on the oil and gas producers. But in the interim period, to the extent that our countries really measure up to the need of investors, because actually you have countries that are resource rich and capital rich. These are basically the GCC countries. They might still need to replenish their sovereign wealth fund, to prepare even more for a rainy day when it comes sometime in the distant future. But given sufficient grantees and investment climate, adequate investment climate, investing in the infrastructure and other structural transformation projects in agriculture and so on, in our countries, in the capital importing countries or deficit countries like Morocco or Sudan or Egypt, might actually have a much higher return even after the interest rate adjustment. But this really again boils down to the matter of trust. So really issues of governance and better management. This is very important. On the side of the creditors, on the other hand, certainly I think this is an issue that, by the way, is a subject that Ishaq is leading us on through the initiative fund, finance for FDL, finance for development. What is it? I forgot, Ishaq. Finance for development. For development. What the L is
lab.
Development Lab. Yes, yeah. Finance for Development Lab. And we are exploring actually, creative thinking about debt sustainability and maybe debt relief modality and things like that, including the SDR that you mentioned for the creditor countries of the region. So I think this would be important to consider. The other thing is also, I think, again, there are opportunities for satisfying part of the investment needs of our countries through partnership with the private sector. The BOT instrument has been utilized very efficiently by some countries. For example, the subway of Santiago and the airport of Amman and all of these mega projects were built through the BBT arrangement with the private sector. So there are possibilities actually to reduce future to incur future indebtedness by increasing trust, improving environment, and then maybe also for the creditors to consider some creative way of reducing the burden, and also to try to engage the private sector in a much more, including the private sector in the GCC countries, because I understand that many GCC countries are shifting from government to government partnership to try to actually encourage their private sector and managers of investment authorities and sovereign wealth fund to deal with the recipient countries in a private sector type, kind of framework.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. We're running out of time, but you did a wonderful summary, really, and the conclusion for our discussion. I think we really need to move, building on this momentum of fighting COVID towards a new compact with the people in terms of internal inclusion, social and economic inclusion, and with our external funder to ensure them that we can grow out of debt and give them good return on their money, whether they are regional investors from the GCC or international investors. And as Dr. Walalu said, we are very much hoping that at the IMF, at the G20, at the G7, they find solutions adapted for our times, also building on the momentum of this amazing reaction to the COVID crisis, including financial, with the creation of these SDRs. So I want to close here so that we're not too late. I want to really thank our wonderful panel. You've really given us the energy to continue on this conversation and to continue the effort. So we're going to nag you and come back to you so that this is a beginning and not an end. I'm very happy that we were able to close to some extent, as promised, with a note of optimism and the call for arms. We're going to leave this with things to do, with a long list of things to do, so that the next period is one where hope will grow better. So thank you, ERF, for these very useful annual meetings, and see you all very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Good to meet everybody.